This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 7th of September 2024. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have a look through the week's news and culture with the leading cultural historian and author, Gavin Plumley. Plus,
when I first took on this role, and somebody would, especially in a place like Ukraine, when they would find out where I worked, they would say, I remember huddling around a radio trying to cut through the noise because we really desperately wanted to hear what was going on.
Monocle's contributing editor Andrew Mueller speaks to the president of Radio Free Europe about how they provide accurate, uncensored news in countries where a free press is threatened. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday. First, though, here's the news. On Friday, a New York judge delayed former US President Donald Trump's sentencing in his hush money criminal case until after the November the 5th election, writing that he wants to avoid the unwarranted perception of a political motive. In the first ever criminal trial of a former or current US president, Trump was convicted on May the 30th on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. French President Emmanuel Macron discussed the importance of maintaining support for Ukraine and the need for a ceasefire in Gaza during talks on Friday with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, said the French presidency. Regarding Ukraine, the two leaders expressed their determination to support the country for as long and as intensively as necessary in its war against Russia, the Elysée said. And Boeing's Starliner spacecraft landed without its crew in a New Mexico desert late on Friday, capping a 3-month test mission hobbled by technical issues. NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, who became the first crew to fly Starliner in June, remained on the International Space Station. What was initially supposed to be an 8-day test has turned into an 8-month mission for the crew, who'll return to Earth on a SpaceX vehicle in February 2025. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday. I'm Georgina Godwin and I'm joined now in the studio by the cultural historian and author of A Home for All Seasons, Gavin Plumley. Gavin, we almost didn't have you here because you just fell off your chair.
Yeah, these very comfortable chairs here in Midori House, but they do have a sort of propensity to recline even when you shouldn't be reclining. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm here now.
Yes, and
thank you.
And upright again.
Yes, sort of. Well, as upright as I ever am.
Gavin, I think the last time we spoke to you in any kind of detail, it was about A Home for All Seasons. Remind us about that book.
Well, the book has been out for 2 years now, and you kindly had me on Meet the Writers when it came out in hardback. It's now out in paperback, and it's, I think, 4th or 5th edition now, wow. Which is really lovely. And, yeah, doing the rounds. But also that odd moment of the season, as it were, coming to an end and allowing my first book to be out there in the wild of book buying and trying to turn my mind to book number 2, which is, I think, going to be rather different. It begins with a very pert bum. So that's all I can say at the moment. But yeah, I'm looking at a lot of posteriors at the moment. So
what fun!
Great fun.
How must that research process be?
Well, it's primary, so hopefully the critics won't go at me. But yeah, no, it's actually I think it is going to be a fun project. I mean, it's got teeth and things, but it's yeah, I just always finding that. You know, it's the second book, it's the second album problem. And the first one was so personal about my home in Herefordshire, about my husband and I moving there, that actually someone said to me, do you feel you've written it now, Gavin? And I said, well, obviously I've written it, you're holding it in your hand. And she said, no, that there isn't anything else to say. And I said, well, there's always something more to say. But I now understand what it is, that once you've written something very personal, to find the same level of passion in something that's not immediately as there for you can be tricky.
There's another kind of aspect to this, is when something very personal is written about someone. So my brother has written another memoir, and it comes out next week. And a lot of it's about me. And people keep saying to me, well, how do you feel about it? And the honest truth is, until now, nobody else had read it, only me. And I could think of Georgina as this abstract character. But actually, now people are beginning to read it, and they come to me and they go, oh, I didn't know that about you or that about you. And I think, wow, that actually really is about me.
Yeah.
It's quite scary.
And it even happens when you are yourself the subject. I mean, it actually happened in a rather odd context. I went to see a therapist about a year and a half ago, who decided in his preparation for our first session that he was going to read my book. And he kept on referring to Gavin and Gavin and using those terrible air quote things. And I thought, well, A, you're using air quotes, so we're not going to get on. But also the idea that he couldn't get his mind around not a fictional construct, but a written construct.
And it is a construct. That is the thing that people need to keep in mind, isn't it?
I mean, you are... Yes, of course, those things probably did happen to you. Well, I hope your brother's done enough research. I'm sure he has, and he knows you well. But there has to be that moment where you step back and say, this is a text-based thing. This is not life as lived.
Let's look at text, and let's take the stories that are dominating headlines either side of the Atlantic. So in America, it's the Georgia shooting and the reaction to that. Should we start off with, well, in fact, the Guardian here reports on it, and this is on the sort of political impact of it. Why don't you start by outlining what happened in case people have missed this very big story?
Well, earlier this week, there was another, I don't say that glibly, high school shooting in Winder, which is about 50 miles northeast of Atlanta in Georgia. And a 13-year-old gun boy, has been arrested. Also, so has his father. His father, Colin Gray, the son, Colt Gray, named, in fact, after a type of assault rifle. I mean...
What chance did the kid have?
Well, there is that, absolutely. Yeah. Though there seems to be an absolute obsession with guns in that household. And in fact, I suppose the judicial process is very interesting in the sense that the father has also been charged now with 2 counts of second-degree murder, 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, and 8 counts of cruelty to children. I mean... And I think why this case is so interesting is because not only is it grimly fascinating and the whole NRA lobby, etc., but of course this is an election year and Georgia is a swing state. And in The Guardian, they're looking at J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee, and his description of high school shootings as having become a fact of life, which I just think, I mean, J.D. Vance has come up with some stupid things before, but this one really does take your breath away. And to play that into the Georgia situation, I think is really, really terrifying, not least when you then look at the split in Georgia, how the vote is going to come about when we get to November, and the vast change in the demographic. White non-college voters were at 43.9%. This is an incredible graph on the NPR, National Public Radio website in the States. And that's gone down to 33.7%. And the black vote, the Latino vote has grown. So that is a really fascinating thing of basically not keeping your powder dry, not stepping back from the brink, but the Republicans absolutely going in there and saying the very worst thing in the very worst situation. And, I mean, they can't help themselves. And I know we spoke before we came on air about Trump actually not being able to help himself and actually not knowing what he's saying. So, I mean, but this is so grim, and it really does dominate the headlines, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and our papers over here.
Let's pick up on that Trump story, because I think it's very interesting in terms of partisan reporting and how people are portraying both this Georgia shooting story, but also what Donald Trump said the other day. He was asked about child support and really just gave a completely incoherent answer. And The Atlantic unpicks that and shows us that it talks about the journalistic urge is always to try and make sense of things for your readers. So a lot of people have been reporting on this going, well, this is probably what he meant and everything. Very few people have said, actually, he had no idea.
Yeah, it's when you read how he responded, this was a meeting at the Economic Club of New York, how he responded to the question about prioritising legislation to make childcare affordable. It is more akin to James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake than it is to any kind of party political broadcast or speech. I spend a lot of time with modernist literature, but he really does take the biscuit here with the way it's not even a stream of consciousness, it's a stream of, verbiage. And it is the incredible ability of the right-wing media, particularly, but not entirely. The Associated Press is in there, the CNN is in there, just trying to justify it and trying to pick out the sense from it. And, luckily, we have publications like The Atlantic who absolutely nail him to the wall with this. We're just saying, we got nothing from this.
Yeah.
And, and certainly when you see those two things playing out side by side, Vance and Trump, we are going to get nothing from that situation. Yeah.
And it's not just in the US, is it? There's a kind of rather wonderful example of partisan reporting here this week too.
This is properly bonkers. In the Telegraph, William Sitwell, who's no stranger to partisan reporting, is writing about a car park, of all things, in Eynsham on the outskirts of Oxford. Parking in Oxford is always a nightmare, and they've tried to expand their park and ride system. The problem with this particular £51 million car park is that you can't actually get into it. They spent so much money, according to the Mirror, on the actual car park that they forgot to keep some of the budget back for attaching it to the road system. Now, William Sitwell takes this, and this is quite amazing. The headline in his comment piece for The Telegraph is, "The empty Oxford car park is a metaphor for Labour's Britain. Bluster, blame and tinkering are the modus operandi that Starmer's government is quickly mastering." Now, I'm no civil engineer, but I'm imagining work on this car park began before the 4th of July. And I should imagine what it speaks of is how our infrastructure in Britain is in such a parlous state. And actually, it's not Starmer's government, it's successive governments, but particularly 14 years of austerity that have meant that, I don't know if you're a driver, Georgina, but I have replaced the tyres on my car several times over the last 2 years, purely because of potholes. And this is what we're dealing with, and that's what, has been handed to the Labour government. Whether they're making the right decisions about dealing that is another matter. But here we have a bit of partisan reporting. I think the bluster, blame and tinkering are not Starmer's, but entirely William Sitwell's.
And of course, partisan reporting in this case is largely harmless. People are
it's funny.
Yeah, they're sentient beings. They'll get from it what they need. But further afield, for instance, where I come from, Zimbabwe, there is mostly only the state-controlled media. And I think you're aware that I challenged that in court. And then ran a radio station here in London which broadcast back into Zimbabwe, trying to let people know what was going on.
Really going on, yeah.
And I think that's a huge need for many places in the world. And indeed, in an era where an increasing number of countries are stifling press freedoms and disinformation is pervasive, it's more important than ever for citizens to have access to transparent and unbiased news stories. So for over 70 years, Radio Free Europe has served as a beacon of hope for people in countries where uncensored news and open debate is less accessible. The station's historically known for broadcasting behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War and is now trusted by modern audiences in Afghanistan, Russia and Ukraine via shortwave and digital platforms. Andrew Mueller spoke to the company's president, Stephen Capus, at Globsec in Prague, and began by asking him what's changed for Radio Free Europe in the last 2.5 years.
Our Ukrainian service has been around now, as of next week, it will be 70 years. This last 2.5 years of that 70 has been an extraordinarily challenging time, and our people are doing enormously important work, brave work. We've had people in the last couple of weeks go into Russia with the Ukrainian forces. Another journalist was very severely injured by a mortar attack. Some of our technical production team saved the lives of a pair of Ukrainian soldiers who they were covering when they came under attack, thanks to the first aid training that they had, so on and so forth. A normal day in the office these days looks a lot different than it did 3 years ago. For these people, many of them grew up in Ukraine. They are covering stories in their neighborhoods where they grew up, where their families still live, where their grandmothers can't quite believe what's happening in their backyards, and yet they've got to remain professional. They've had to continue to cover stories with an attempt to adhere to professional editorial standards. Adherence to the principles of a free press is something that is vitally important. But on any given day, our investigative journalists might, at the beginning of the day, come across newfound Russian atrocities. They document that. The next day, they may be holding the Zelensky government accountable on anti-corruption practices, say. So it's enormously challenging work, and I'm enormously proud of them.
You mentioned earlier that 70 years of Radio Free Europe's Ukrainian service. The last 2.5 years in particular, has that made you think of, does it strike you that there are parallels between the work that the Ukrainian and the Russian service are doing now and what they were doing during the Cold War? Is this the Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty mission reborn?
I think that's an excellent way of putting it. When I first took on this role, and somebody would, especially in a place like Ukraine, when they would find out where I worked, they would say, I remember huddling around a radio, trying to cut through the noise because we really desperately wanted to hear what was going on. Or they say, my grandmother tells me these stories, my parents tell me these stories. Never did I expect that we would be so reliant on your programs to know what's really going on. And it happens every time I travel in Lithuania, Latvia. This organization has held an important place on the world stage for decades now, and I think there is a renewed interest in what we do, and for good reason. The mission is vitally important, and we've got to continue in the face of the most enormous challenges that I think I've ever seen news people have to go through. We have people who are imprisoned as we speak. We have people whose families are harassed, subject to intimidation inside places like Belarus. And yet, the people who work for this organization, the women and men of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, are extraordinarily dedicated and talented and committed to the mission.
Are you able to quantify how much impact you do manage to make with Russian audiences and Belarusian audiences?
We are. And I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes just from this past year. The conventional wisdom is, your feeds are going to be jammed, your websites are going to be blocked, your journalists are going to be imprisoned.
And all that stuff happens, though.
All of that does happen. However, at the same time, somebody living inside Russia is fed a daily diet of the types of messaging that the state would like them to receive. So what's happened? Within the last year, we've seen Alexei Navalny meet an untimely demise. Mm-hmm. We've seen a rather dramatic terror strike within Moscow. We've seen an effort from the Wagner Brigade to do who knows what. But at each of these different times, up to and including this recent incursion into Kursk, something interesting's happened. Even though they're getting a steady diet of what the Russian government would like them to receive and consume, they're coming to us in huge numbers. We see enormous spikes from within Russia for our content during times. What does that say? That means that people are saying, something's going on. I hear what our government is saying, and these guys are known for having a different point of view.
That is interesting but unsurprising, because I think it's true of people living in most totalitarian or authoritarian states. They kind of know that what they're hearing from official channels is probably, well, an interpretation of events. And you know, humans, well, some humans at least, are curious people. But are you able to give any insight into what kind of numbers we're talking about? Are these big leaps from a small base, or are they actually quite significant fractions of the population you're reaching?
Depends on at different times, and it depends on how successful Russia is at trying to block some of these things. There's a pretty steady base that we have, and we were just talking in here at this conference today about some of the technology that allows us to do circumvention of blocking technology. And there's some really great stuff that's out there that's making it easier, that doesn't put the audience members at as great of a risk as they might have been in the past. But like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty these days is a lot of different things. Yeah, we still have radio in the name, but you know, these days, if somebody is living inside Iran, they're turning to us for things, not just traditional news, but podcasts on women's rights. What's it like inside the notorious Evin prison in Tehran? What is the latest on music, Western music, that in some cases is outright banned? And 21 podcasts a week just in Persian language and from our Partisan language services being directed inside Iran. And it's being done by primarily younger members of our staff who grew up in Iran. They are thankful to be out of there, and they're looking to give back. And this is being done native language, native dialects. You know, we're operating in 23 different countries, 27 different languages, and making that connection is absolutely vital.
Monocle's Andrew Mueller in conversation with the president of Radio Free Europe, Stephen Capers. And he's right. I mean, it is absolutely vital, this kind of work, isn't it?
Completely. And to get those serious stories, balanced reporting, a real sense of what's happening on the ground to the people on the ground. It seems so obvious. You know, here we sit in the centre of London, but actually I think when you are in Gaza, if you are in Kyiv, you need to know what is actually happening around you. And no, it's invaluable work.
If you're in London, however, you would think that the most important thing happening right now was Oasis getting back together and what they're charging for tickets.
Well, this is another story that's dominating the press on both sides of the Atlantic. The New York Times has absolutely gone to town. In fact, back in 1996, when Oasis was sort of in its heyday, they said, what Oasis has done in Britain is to unify an entire country under the banner of a single pop act. Well, what they're doing now is dividing a nation under the banner of a single pop act because of their dynamic pricing structure for the band's forthcoming tour. I won't be going. It's not my thing. I was bullied mercilessly at boarding school to the soundtrack of Oasis. So it is quite a significant psychological trigger for me. But what is amazing is that basically Ticketmaster have really made hay out of this situation. It was always known that Oasis was that their reunion was going to be under significant demand for tickets. And the dynamic pricing structure, dynamic for whom? Well, dynamic for Ticketmaster, because the more that tickets are asked for, the higher the price seems to go. And when the band themselves were questioned about this, I think it was Liam Gallagher told one fan to shut up. There was also some other language which I don't think is Monocle Radio friendly that are used on X. And this is seemingly here to stay. In the reporting in the New York Times, but it's also in The Guardian extensively, Michael Rapino, who is the CEO of Live Nation, indicated that this kind of process is going to be rolled out absolutely across the world. And for me, as someone who would much rather spend time with classical music, I'm really minded of the way that media reports so much on the elitism of classical music and never about the elitism of an act like Oasis coming back, or even Taylor Swift, of course, who was dominating the headlines earlier this year. But the vast prices, I mean, the sort of, mortgage defaulting level of price that people are paying for these tickets is eye-watering. Last night, I was at the Royal Albert Hall. I was at the BBC Proms with another absolutely amazing British musical export, which was Sir Simon Rattle. He was conducting his new orchestra, the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra. And you could have gone to that concert and stood, as many people are standing at Oasis, you could have stood in the arena for £8. There is absolutely no way you can find an £8 ticket. I mean, even the booking fee on Ticketmaster is so inflated beyond that. And I think we really have to think about where elitism truly sits. The Labour government, for instance, are going after cheap, low-hanging fruit with winter fuel and VAT on private school fees. And actually what they really need to be doing is going for the fruit at the top of the tree, which is the multinationals and these vast corporations that are found behind these extraordinary paywalls where people are paying vast amounts of money and they are not being properly taxed and they are not being held to account. I'm glad it's been mentioned in Parliament this week, but, judging by this reporting, it's not gone far enough, and they really need to unpick all of this way of impoverishing people pursuing popular culture.
Now, there is a British social attitude survey that's come out this week that looks at some of these things. But what it also shows is that there's been a striking fall in pride in Britain's history. But historians say that's quite a good thing.
Yeah, this is a weird strand of reporting this week, dividing history and culture. And someone who calls himself a cultural historian, you may imagine that I don't particularly like that idea. I don't think you can have Shakespeare without some knowledge of the Tudors into the Jacobeans. I think that may be where we've got to go back to basics. Yes, we've had the Colston statue in Bristol, which is one of the examples in the Guardian's reporting. And we've had many other culture wars, a phrase I also hate. But I think what we need to do is to celebrate our culture, be acknowledging of our history, and see the links between them, but also see that culture can rise above history. It is not separate from it, it derives from it. In fact, only last week I was in Suffolk and in a tiny little village called Wenhaston. There's a beautiful little parish church there. And in Wenhaston Parish Church, there's this incredible doom painting, an image of the Last Judgment. You wouldn't know it's there, there's no announcement. If you're a churchgoer, if you're, as in a sort of church visitor on a tourist basis, you would probably know about it. But there, in this tiny village, is this incredible piece of British culture. And were that to be Italy, were that to be France, were that to be Spain, it would be on postcards, on posters, on T-shirts. It would be kept well, and it's very well kept in the church, but there's just that sense that we don't embrace who we have been, who we're going to be, and who we are right now. And perhaps we'd do better to spend less on Oasis tickets and, in fact, look more at the things that are around us and understand where they've come from. And indeed, to understand where Oasis came from killed off, I think, by New Labour. Maybe they'll be killed off by New Labour too.
Gavin, thank you very much indeed. That's Gavin Plumley. His book is called A House for All Seasons.
A Home for All Seasons.
Home for All Seasons. It's out in paperback now. And that's all for Monocle on Saturday. Thanks to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan, and of course to my guest, Gavin Plumley. Monocle on Saturday returns next weekend. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.